This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible.
alwayspossible.co.uk. How far and how often do you walk? One of the true privileges of living in the UK is its walkability. No arid and inhospitable deserts or ice shelves, no prairies or outbacks with nothing for miles. Awesome as all of those things are, they can make the luxury of just putting on some comfortable shoes and getting lost much more dangerous than in Britain. And increasingly, this great British privilege of accessible woodland, coastal paths, national parks and trails is not just the pastime of ramblers and earnest hikers, but an asset being understood by people who lead busy, urban lives, but have to consciously avoid burnout and their stooped RSI-driven existence in front of flickering screens. We all need to walk. In most towns and cities, you'll now find net walking sessions, tours and walks that combine cultural history with business development. Geographical mapping, possibly since the COVID-19 pandemic, seems to be something growing as people seek to recalibrate a physical life alongside the ever-intensive digital ones. As we staycation, we understand our neighbouring towns, cities, regions, countryside a lot more in detail. But how transformational can all this be? As the lines between planning, topography and health become blurred, more and more people are taking an interest in the future of offices and housing, air quality and transport, landscapes and land. The impact of a business is more rooted than ever in its footprint, metaphorical and physical, and where its people are going, how they're getting there, and their experiences when they're in different environments. My guest in this episode is a guerilla geographer, a creative explorer, an author, teacher, and entrepreneur. One of his missions is to have our big cities treated like national parks, where conservation, planning, biodiversity, and accessibility are protected by the people that use them. And another mission is to crowdsource a walking map that covers the whole of the UK, co-created by everyone and our shared understanding of the best ways to get from A to B, whether it's a short hop or whether it's from city to city, wherever it is, safely and responsibly in those pair of comfy shoes. I'm Richard Freeman. This is the Possibility Club, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Dan Raven-Ellison. Hello. It's the Possibility Club, and this is all about practical bravery this season, and I'm delighted and privileged to be talking to special guests about their missions and how they're rolling their sleeves up to change the world one step at a time. And this episode is no different, and I have an extraordinary guest who describes himself as a guerilla geographer, a creative explorer. He is a founder of Slow Ways, which we will talk about, and the National Park Cities Project. You're more likely to find him up a mountain or in a forest with a GoPro strapped to his head than you are in any kind of corporate boardroom. I'm delighted to be chatting to Dan Raven-Ellison. Dan, how are you today?
I'm doing great. You know, it's raining outside quite heavily, and I absolutely love being inside when it's warm, when it's raining outside. So I'm in a good spot. I love that, yeah.
So you're not a weather junkie. You're not an extreme sort of, the more howling the gale it is, the more you want to be out embracing the elements.
I'm not sure if the worse the weather, the more I want to be out there is a correlation that I subscribe to. But, you know, the idea that when you're in a tent and you're all cozy in your sleeping bag and you don't have to be outside that sound of rain and knowing that you're in that space, I think is one of the best things in the world.
I completely agree with you. In our attic, we've got this kind of loft room, lots and lots of Velux windows bringing loads of light. But in the storm and in the rain, it sounds a bit like being in a tent. It's got that same kind of vibe. Tell me a little bit about your journey to here. What's led you to be a guerrilla explorer?
People will know what a guerrilla gardener is. And then guerrilla gardeners go out there and they bring some joy into the world and make places a bit better by being a little bit disruptive in the landscape. And guerrilla artists often have a very similar vibe. And guerrilla geography, me, is very similar, really. Those are acts of geography in many ways about making places better. But guerrilla geography is radical, alternative, surprising geographies that get people thinking differently about the world in order, hopefully, to make the world better in one way or another, which I know is very, very subjective. And I used to be a geography teacher and started off with guerrilla geography by creating provocative children's books that challenged children and parents to get out and explore outdoors more. And it's not really my paper of choice, but it's partially inspired by an article in the Daily Mail, which basically showed how children's right to roam and freedom was getting restricted and strangled generation by generation, and believe both in the power of play for creativity and imagination and hope and health for young people, but also the power of geography for how we make sense of the world and how we can make the world better. So by bringing together playfulness and geography, I think actually we can make seismic changes.
In a way, it's kind of not reclaiming, but creating a new association with the word geography, which for a lot of people, the last time they've been consciously connected to that word will have been at school, possibly taught by you. It's quite dry, isn't it? It's about it's coastal erosion, Oxbow Lakes, longshore drift, looking at a kind of through a fact-based lens.
That's like a list of things that you might find in a geography textbook, you know. But everything that happens anywhere in the universe happens everywhere, whether it's an itch on your head right through to the spin of the planet. So everything that relates to the ecological and climate crises through to where we are at the moment with social injustices all relate to places and the people in them. And, you know, I've got a teenager and I'd often think about with him how he could come home from, you know, a day at school and he could be an architect of the emotion of our house purely by whether or not he asked how our day was or whether he decided to be really grumpy with us. And so we're all place makers at all these different scales. And even the idea of rewilding that people like, you know, quite often that might be at a sort of intercontinental, regional scale, but it might also be about just creating a space for a spider to sort of do its thing in the corner of your house. And so geography exists at all these scales at the same time. And so whether it's the guerrilla gardener putting up a paving slab and making that a bit wilder, or whether it's thinking about where you want to go on holiday, like that's all geography. And I think that science and history have done a very good job of creating places where people are very aware that they're recreationally engaging in science or history. Geography, people are playing with that all the time, but because of so many boring, dry textbooks, people think that it's something that it's not quite.
Yeah. You said you used to be a teacher.
Well, you know, I used to be a teacher in the classroom, but a lot of my projects are still about education and communication and thinking. I think that everyone is engaged in thinking about how we can make places better. I mean, it's just a central part to what makes us human, I think, in terms of, you know, what can I do to make my home more comfortable, enjoyable? Where can I go that's going to make my life more exciting? How can I choose to buy things or behave in ways that will more positively, hopefully, influence other people in other places? And so then I'm interested in how, through various social campaigns or interventions, and create new pathways in people's imaginations about how they can use that inherent power of being a geography activist, that thing that we all are, to actually have positive impacts rather than negative impacts on our friends and our neighbours, wherever they are.
Do you think people are becoming a bit more conscious about how they use the kind of places and spaces around them? I mean, I think, you know, certainly the number of conversations about rewilding certain parts of community, about the kind of role of beaches and river walks, and it's not just seeming in the hands of planners and environmentalists anymore. I'm noticing it a lot more in conversations with friends. You know, people, it seems a little bit more in tune about some of the spaces around their urban lives that they hadn't quite connected with before and are now exploring a bit more. Maybe that's just something I'm noticing. But do you get that sense that we're waking up a bit more to that?
You know, maybe there was just a shift in geography education a couple of decades ago that's coming to fruition, and people are more aware. I don't know about the word more, actually. I think that people have always been preoccupied with making their situation and their places and their communities better, ideally. And I think that's been the case since the dawn of humanity and before then. And you go back a couple hundred years and think about a lot of what the Victorians did. They did a lot of really awful stuff for the world, the sort of British Victorians, but they also did an awful lot of very interesting things around creating sort of better green spaces in parks, planting trees, doing certain things that they knew would bring better health and well-being to people, creating institutions that enable people to come together to get organized around making progress on certain things. And it wasn't just 200 years ago. We could go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years and also find people who were also getting themselves organized as well. So I think there's a heightened level of awareness of maybe people's connectivity to things like the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, things which previously there wasn't the evidence or argument for. And so people are feeling more activated around those particular issues. But I think just the general thread of a human being wanting to make a place better for themselves and their neighbours, I think is a very old thing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I do wonder if actually technology has enabled us to be able to visualize it a bit better. Just the sort of the access to mapping through GPS and the kind of investment that's gone into a lot of satellite imagery and stuff suddenly means you can play a little bit more with it. You can start to see places. YouTube's full of millions and millions of videos of people sticking a GoPro on their head and going for walks and going mountaineering and going down in strange places. And the fact that you can see it and engage it in kind of bite-sized ways. Certainly I see my kids, there's a kind of different language and a different visual language with which they're kind of starting to see what the world and what places can offer in new ways, perhaps.
Yeah, I think the lens has changed, right? It's like from space, literally we can see more of what's going on in the world. And also we're able to zoom in far deeper into what's going on in the world as well. So my point would be, I think that I'm not sure that people's energy levels overall have increased for investing in themselves or their community or places, but there's been a shift in how people are thinking about that and what they're investing in as a result.
Yeah. Tell me about Slowways, which is a social enterprise?
It's a grassroots initiative. It's an idea. It's a principle. It's supported by the social enterprise, a community interest company that we set up to help make it a success. But really, it's just a really deeply old idea again. It's something that people have been doing for about 2 million years, which is walking from one place to another. And it's founded on the principle that we should always be able to walk reasonably, directly, safely, enjoyably, accessibly between any two neighboring places. But since the advent, basically, of the motor car, and depending on where you are in the world, how private land is organized, actually, there's often barriers, obstacles, things that stop people from being able to make that journey by foot or by wheel. And, where we are at the moment with the state of cost of living, health, the climate, of course, it should always be possible to walk to the next village or town over if you want to. Doing that is about, having an impact, which is going beyond yourself as well, right? So Slowways is about creating this national network of walking routes that connects all the towns, all the cities across Great Britain, making it easier for people to see and imagine how they might plan one journey for another. And people often say, well, what about Google Maps? And it's, well, Google Maps is great, but we also know that Google Maps will likely kill you on an A road if you're going over a long distance. And then OS maps are fantastic, but what OS will do is it'll show you all the possible paths, but it doesn't answer the question, that age-old question going back 2 million years of someone saying to another person, what's the best way to go? And depending on the state of your legs or what you're carrying or the time of year, the best way to go can be very different, even if you're like a highly expert explorer. But the way I think about Slowways is that it's not really just about creating this sort of network of recommended walking routes. It's about creating social infrastructure that does so much more. And so in every route that someone shares, in every route that someone goes and reviews for us to make sure it's good enough to be in the network, someone is saying hello to people along the way. They're spending some money maybe in a local post office. They're getting on the bus and spending time with people. They're improving their own health, their own well-being. They're creating connections to nature, to heritage. They're creating culture. And so it's this infrastructure really for joy, health, hope, climate, saving people money. And so, yes, it's a project about walking, but it's about doing all these things that walking can do for us as well. And, although it's this idea really that's a couple million years old, it's been made possible because of our ability to use really fantastic technology and big data and collaboration across that infrastructure. So, I actually started the project off just before the pandemic, held a hack day, created thousands of kilometers of routes with a whole lot of absolutely amazing volunteers, and then planned to go to different regions of the UK to run workshops to create the rest of the network. But then the pandemic came along and I had thought that the project was going to just falter. But about 15 volunteers who came to that original hack day got together and then hacked together a combination of Zoom, OS leisure maps, giant Google spreadsheets, this very like available, free, ubiquitous sort of tech. Put a call out. 700 volunteers came forward, invested a year's worth of time in a single month to create 100,000 kilometers of routes that drafted the initial network. And it was actually, I think, the pandemic that catalyzed that to happen so quickly, because there were lots of people who loved geography, who loved walking, who were trapped indoors, who had the time and could see the value, maybe even more so, of walking to get that done. And so ever since then, actually, the project has been about making sure this network that was largely drafted from people's kitchens, sinks and conservatories actually works on the ground. And so it's this beautiful, imaginative project that, like I say, in one sense is not new at all, but another way is desperately needed because we've somehow, forgotten how to move the landscape as we once always did.
Mm-hmm. So lots of listeners to this podcast come from the business community, business leaders, entrepreneurs, people thinking about how in the 21st century, their enterprise can be way more than just selling stuff to people who may or may not need it. And it's about what they can be a part of. How can the power and energy of a business and all the things that it touches do something quite radical and extraordinary in the world? In terms of Slowways, how can people perhaps connect with that, not just on an individual basis, people being part of the community, but organizations and movements and networks and things like that as well?
I think that Slowways is an incredible gift, not just to give to other people who are around now, but for future generations as well. I think thinking about the impact of creating this national walking network is about creating all these benefits for other people, but through doing this really humble thing, which is just called going for a walk. And anyone listening to this can help because we've created all these routes that we think walk on the ground. But the big challenge with Slowways is we need to find people who can go and walk the routes to make sure they are good enough for other people to follow in their footsteps. Mm-hmm. And the more people who say, yes, this is a good way to go, the more confidence that will give other people to go that way as well. So a great thing that the businesses and organizations can do to help is to go to the Slowways website and sort of type in their town or wherever they have offices, see where there are local routes that need walking, and then as a team go and walk them. And that could be part of a volunteer day or an environment day or a well-being morning. But it could also be about just having a weeting, which is this Dutch word that means having a walking meeting, where because you're then walking on a meeting, you're probably actually going to have all kinds of thoughts and ideas and connections you wouldn't make by just being stuck in an office or on a Zoom call. So you can go to the website, go and walk a route, leave a review afterwards. And not only will you enjoy the walk, but you would have helped with this incredible large-scale intergenerational project that has numerous benefits. So we'd love for as many people to help as possible.
Brilliant.
This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible. But who are we?
Always Possible works with ambitious businesses, charities, and public services that are thinking about what's next.
From architects to aerospace companies, puppet theatres to primary schools, business networks to big data analysts.
If you're wanting to be brave with some big decisions or to be clearer about what to prioritise, then an award-winning workshop from the Always Possible team is a brilliant starting point.
We care about just one thing: building ideas that work.
For creative, intuitive, and practical expertise, consider Always Possible as your strategic partner. Find out more about how we could power up your mission. Visit alwayspossible.co.uk.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Where does it go? Is this just about making the maps more detailed and more inclusive and more accessible, so it just keeps growing as it is? Or do you see this as the sort of stepping stone towards other ways of taking those principles and philosophies and doing, decentralized, crowdsourced geography? What's the potential of it?
Well, we're very focused on Slowways, on creating recommended ways for people to walk between places. And we want to deepen that into our culture in Britain so that people are not just walking 10 kilometers for the fun of it, which is obviously very important, but also walking those sort of distances for all kinds of other reasons as well, whether that's someone trying to get to a job or going from a festival or walking back from university, or whether you need to go and get something from the shops. That people are beginning to think about how to merge together what they normally think of as being something that might be recreational with other reasons for moving through the landscape as well. And ultimately, what we want to see is millions of people walking more often, further, and for more purposes, more of the time. Mm-hmm. And thinking about that, not just in terms of the numbers of people, but actually the way in which our country in Britain has developed means that there are all kinds of injustices that mean that people, because of their geography, their class, their background, their ethnicity, their ability to use their legs, can't access swathes of the country. Mm-hmm. And so it's thinking not just about, well, where can we give recommended routes of using present paths, but I think it's about thinking about where new pathways and new cultural invitations can make new ideas and people feel more welcome in different places. And so I think that what you're touching on there is completely translatable to thinking about how can you use the same sort of system for thinking about other kinds of pathways to other kinds of solutions that might be able to be thought of. And I just invite anyone listening to have a look at the Slow Ways website and think, how could that same way of mass collaboration be used to tackle other social issues?
Absolutely. You touched there a little bit on the sort of accessibility and safety and that sort of restrictions, and so that yes, there'll be restrictions on people because of their conditions and circumstances, perhaps, but also the kind of land ownership rules in this country are opaque and often historically weird, and I've always favoured the people that own a space rather than those that want to perfectly reasonably walk across it. And so I'll be interested to know how in your kind of mapping and this directory of routes, how does that kind of bump up against some of these conversations around right to roam, high profile conversations around Dartmoor and camping on there? Just the other day I was out with my family, and we live near the seaside, which is extraordinary, but a route that we walk very often, my wife said, oh, there's a sign there that says this beach is private. I've never seen that before. Are we not supposed to be here? And so then we had a big conversation as a family around, well, how can you shut off a beach? It's not fenced. There's just a sign. Whose sign is that? What does that mean? And so we had, my kids having quite a big conversation then about, well, how do you own the beach? How do you own a forest? And my answers are pretty inadequate. So I'm interested to know where your work sits within those kind of conversations about opening up space, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I think we should have far more rights to far more spaces. I think when you have that feeling, you're in the city or you're on the beach somewhere and you feel that inherent injustice, you're not allowed to go somewhere. Whenever you experience that, it's probably quite right that you should have more access than you do, and not just to walk on a thin slither through the city or through the beach, but there needs to be far more spaces where we can listen to music and have picnics and stop and rest without the fear of being moved on. I mean, I think that while in England, we don't have the pleasures of the levels of access that they have in Scotland or Scandinavia, for example, it is important to also remember, though, that there are some parts of the world, like swathes of continental North America, where access is even more limited. And if you were to stray onto the private land, you stand the risk of extreme violence, maybe, rather than what we might experience here. So I think that I would like far more access in England, but I think the paths are really important as well for a number of reasons. I mean, I think the ideal solution would be to have something between where we are in Scotland and England. So have the level of access you have in Scotland, England, where appropriate. But what Scotland desperately needs is a far better path network. What paths do is they create, I think, routes of invitation that, especially when they're signed, can let people know they're welcome, but can also make sure they're going in a way which is culturally and ecologically sensitive to the land owners and users, whether they're farmers or whether they are ground nesting birds. And so I think that paths are very useful, but in any right to roam that we might win, which I hope we do get far more right and freedom to roam, we also need to catch up around our responsibilities. And I think that there are some nations in the world where people are brought up in communities where they are more in tune with nature and their responsibilities to the rest of their communities. But I think there's a form of paternalism that particularly exists in England that means that when people do get their freedom, sometimes they're not necessarily as responsible as they could be. And that minority of people then help to give current large-scale landowners strength to their elbow in saying, well, we can't possibly have a right to roam. Mm-hmm. So I think we should have far more rights and freedoms. But at the same time, there needs to be far more learning in schools and elsewhere about how to look after those rights. And so I think the two things have to come hand in hand.
That's really interesting. And that tension is something that I've been coming across a lot recently. So I'm based in Sussex, which is dominated by the majestic South Downs, which, unlike a lot of other national parks that maybe are kind of contained sort of, an oval or a patch of land like the New Forest or Dartmoor, the Downs is a kind of a weird snaking sort of tract from Winchester right down to Eastbourne.
I love the Downs. It's one of my favourite national parks for sure.
It's extraordinary. But, that sort of dichotomy that you've talked about to an extent comes up a huge amount in the work I do as a consultant interested in ecosystems and interested in sustainable economic growth and how you create prosperous places for people to live and explore and work and learn and all those sorts of things. And there's some businesses on the on the South Downs that have suddenly had a real opportunity to balance that sort of environmental cultivation with commercial acumen. Vineyards, I'm thinking particularly, but also lots of other very interesting kind of horticulture and agricultural businesses and things like that. Their beef is that they are incredibly restricted in how they can develop facilities or resources or transport infrastructure so that people can come and visit and enjoy, or that they can do projects around their business because of the South Downs policy. But then I do a lot of work with the South Downs team who are absolutely justified in their single mission, which is to protect that land.
The thing is that when you look at land use as a whole and look at where people are, there are just so many injustices. I mean, ultimately, I'm talking about whether or not there should be more right to roam or not. And more access. But fundamentally, there are millions of people who face barriers, cultural, psychological, physical barriers that mean that they can't access green space at the levels they should do, or nature at the quality they should do. One of my frustrations, I live in Exeter now, but being in London, was the sheer number of golf courses, which even close to where I used to live in London during the pandemic, there were people in some of the most nature-deprived, green space-deprived wards in London, in flats overlooking golf courses, which were effectively ecological deserts. I mean, they admittedly contribute to helping with flooding and other things in the city. But I think that many of those large golf courses in London have no place in the city at all. And the number of parks that you could fit in them that would be super multifunctional for all kinds of people of all kinds of backgrounds, of all kinds of generations, and for wildlife, the opportunity there is phenomenal. And then when you look over the wider British landscape, I think that the sheer amount of land which is devoted to forms of land management, which excludes people and promotes the exploitation of animals and wildlife, is highly problematic. And so many of the very large scale landowners aren't liking the idea of someone coming wild camping on their land.
No.
They are happy to manage the whole of that land system in a way that is basically ecologically destructive and exclusionary.
Absolutely.
So we have to challenge some of these ways of thinking about how land is used in the country.
So it feels like there's a conversation that needs to be had outside of just those kind of land-based industries and those vested interests with all of us, because most people in the UK are only a few miles away from access to a national park, and they are our national parks. But bring me to your national parks project. Tell me a bit more about that.
A while ago, I started sort of exploring cities in different ways. I walked across Mexico City, Mumbai, London, making time lapses that showed what the cities looked like according to the distribution of deprivation in those urban areas. So I'd create these massive time lapses where I'd walk across the whole of London, walk across the whole of Mexico City. And I was doing that when I was still a teacher. And what I was very interested in was how we represent and how we think about places, and how quite often our imagination of what Mexico City or London is like are distorted to what the media show us and how we think about those places. the majority of London is, swathes of it is Victorian terrace houses, but we wouldn't necessarily think of that from just like TV programs we watch and so on. So I'm really interested in representation, interested in how we think about places, and also love national parks. And was very fortunate to do a project with my son, who was about 9 at the time, and we visited all 15 of the UK's inspiring, distinctive, remarkable, beautiful national parks in this really short period of time. And despite some of the challenges we were just discussing, I think that national parks are simply one of humanity's very best ideas. I mean, there's family protected areas around the world, from deserts through to rainforests. If we did not have that family of protected areas, where we would be now in terms of the ecological and climate crisis, who knows, really. But I got thinking about that and thinking about how when you look at that family of national parks around the world, there are national parks that are everything from glaciers and deserts through to moorlands and rainforests, everything you can imagine in terms of the internationally recognized habitats, apart from one, which is urban areas. And historically, I can understand why, but I got thinking about that and thinking, well, London, my home city, is home to, according to the Great Green Space for Information for Greater London and various scientists, home to about 15,000 species of wildlife, making it arguably one of the most species-rich regions of the UK, with more pairs of breeding peregrine falcon in London than there are in Yosemite National Park or the Peak District National Park. Certainly, pound for pound, compare Death Valley or Glacier National Parks to London, London wins. And yes, there are about 9 million very large mammals called humans moving around that city, but there are an abundance of other species as well. And, ultimately, what I came to realize was a couple of things, I guess, is that firstly, this idea that urban life is worth less than rural life, the idea that rural life and wilder places that is somehow more pristine and more wild is somehow more valuable, is ultimately flawed, that an urban red fox or London badger is just as valuable, just as important, just as brilliant as a fennec fox or an Arctic fox or, some badger on another continent somewhere else. And that the people that live in cities are just as valuable and important as well. And critically, in terms of power, it's cities that are largely decimating other parts of the planet. So it's the consumers and decision makers in cities like London that are having a negative impact outside of the urban footprint. But it's also people in cities who tend to have more power directly under their feet to do things, whether it's rewilding part of their garden or making their street a bit greener or having more outdoor learning in schools. It's people in cities who often have incredible power to very quickly do things to make where they live directly greener, healthier, wilder too. So I came into the national park cities thinking that cities were missing from the family of national parks worldwide. But what I came to realize over about 7 years of campaigning, leading to London becoming the world's first national park city, working with thousands of people across the city, was that actually what's missing is not cities from that family of national parks. It's that national park thinking is missing from cities.
Yes.
In other words, we're missing large scale, long-term systems, holistic thinking, the kind of thing that we expect to see in national parks. But in cities, we tend to see short-term, isolated, broken thinking, which is often divided by private land ownership or public land ownership or third sector or public sector or private sector, or thinking over political terms. So the gift of the idea of the national park city is to reframe the very purpose of the entire landscape. So we know what the purpose of a city is. The purpose of a city is a place where we come together in large numbers to exchange goods and services, to eat and sleep, to watch Netflix, and to enjoy partying, right? That's the purpose of a city.
Okay.
We know that the purpose of a national park is to come together to have a better relationship with nature and to enjoy ourselves. So the idea of combining those two is where this is at, so that people growing up and doing business in and doing policy in the city begin to imagine over the long term that the purpose of the city is not just about consumption. Actually, it's about how you can creatively come together to rethink your future and to use that idea of the national park city as leverage to begin to imagine alternative futures and to demand alternative futures that live up to that vision. And London's at the very beginning of that journey, but everyone who's listening to this can contribute to that story and that leverage by supporting the National Park City idea.
It makes a lot of sense to me. and I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to this, is it cutting through with the people to whom it needs to cut through with? I mean, you've just said London's been declared the first national park city. I mean, that can't have been easy. Congratulations on that. Who did you need to convince? And who do you still need to convince?
Well, the big thing was, firstly, that we decided that we wanted to create a new kind of mandate that existed outside of legislation. So a national park city is not a national park according to sort of English legislation. And to secure that, it was 7 years of campaigning, getting grassroots support across the city, persuading all the mayoral candidates that were standing for election in London, getting the support of Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, the majority of London's elected councillors across all the wards, and lots of other support as well, to get us to that point where we could say that we had the ability to lead on this national park city. Is it cutting through as it could do, or hitting the right people? On a small scale with some people, yes. As much as I'd like, no. But I take a very long-term view on this. I think it's interesting to consider that between the first national park being created in the US and the first one being created in Germany, there was a gap of 100 years. I don't have quite that much patience. But the thing is, sometimes it takes a while for an idea to percolate and to gestate and for people to get it. And I think that the more people who support the idea of the national park city in London, and the more people see how they can bring it to life, either in their organizations, in their policy, in their homes, the more it will come to life. But I was very excited a couple of years ago that Adelaide became the world's second national park city. They're actually supported by taxes, effectively, for their national park city to be successful. And there are other cities around the world that are looking forward to sort of getting that status as well. And I think what's interesting about that is, if you imagine there being a family of national park cities around the world, then actually a family of cities that are thinking about how to make their cities greener, healthier, wilder, that can look to the different cultural practices and solutions that are taking place in other cities and think about how they could translate into their own cultures and places, could be extraordinarily powerful.
What do you want to be famous for, Dan? In 100 years' time, then, when there are hundreds of national park cities and people are looking back at your role in this, what do you want them to be saying?
I don't know if fame is, my favorite word, really.
It's very few people's favorite word, but it's a good provocation.
It's a great provocation. I think that what I'm really interested in doing, given the work that I'm doing, is about creating space for others. The London National Park City is about creating a space where different ideas can emerge and people can come together around an idea, but take it on as their own to make that happen in a way that's going to work for them in their community, but with that common vision. And with Slow Ways as well, it's about putting radical trust in people to share and walk and talk about routes, but they're doing it in their own way. And with both of these projects, it's about having radical trust in others, but creating space for others to then do good work themselves off the back of that idea. So I think I'd probably want to be known as a geographer for creating space that has enabled other people to do beautiful things.
That is a very fine thing to be associated with. Dan, Raven-Ellison, it's extraordinary what you're doing, and it's a real pleasure to discuss it. Thank you very much for being on the Possibility Club.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Possibility Club, Practical Bravery. If you enjoyed this episode, do like, share, review, tell everybody about it. Look in the show notes for all the details of today's guest, stuff we talked about, stuff that's of interest, new things to read, new things to listen to. And if you are running a business or a charity and you are trying to accelerate or improve the impact that you have in the world, if you want to be famous for what you do and what you change rather than just what you sell, then talk to us. alwayspossible.co.uk. We want to hear from you, we want to talk to you, we want to amplify and elevate your ideas, and who knows, we might be able to help you feel more confident and clear about what's next. alwayspossible.co.uk. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new special guest and a new insight on practical bravery in action.
The Possibility Club is an Always Possible podcast. The interviewer was Richard Freeman for Always Possible, and the producer and editor was me, Chris Thorpe Tracy, for Lo-Fi Arts. Have a good week.
alwayspossible.co.uk
Lo-Fi